Welcome to this week's Rural School Advocates of Iowa Capital Recap video. I'm Margaret Buckton, your professional advocate. In today's agenda, we're going to talk about budget targets, floor action this week, charter schools received committee approval in the House, student behavior is now on the House calendar, what's next, the property tax bill's next steps, and advocacy actions for the week. Well, in Wednesday's Iowa Capital Dispatch article, they talked about the state budget. A first step before those budget bills can move is knowing how much each of those committees can spend, and those all add up to the state budget target. The Senate Republicans released their $9.623 billion budget target this week for fiscal 27. That's below Governor Reynolds' proposed $9.666 billion budget. Senator Kreinbrink, the Senate Appropriations Chair, said in a news release that this continues the Republicans' goal of setting a responsible, sustainable budget. It would leave Iowa with a projected $4.8 billion in its ending balance, the Taxpayer Relief Fund, and other reserves. Senator Majority Leader Klimisch also talked about continuing that conservative funding of the priorities for Iowans. And next fiscal year is the second full year with the historic flat tax for Iowans at 3.8%. He talks about that process in the coming weeks. What about the House? House Republicans plan to release their budget proposal next week. Speaker Grassley told reporters on Wednesday. There are some subjects like funding for paraeducator pay, that $14 million in supplemental salary that Speaker Grassley said will likely come up again during budget negotiations, but he said that more specific items would be discussed in the coming weeks. Speaker Grassley said House Republicans were focused on fully funding Medicaid and passing a conservative budget that fully funds those priorities that we've laid out. The state will be using money from that Taxpayer Relief Fund for the shortfall in the current fiscal year Medicaid funding, and then increase premium taxes retroactively applying to health maintenance organizations to address projected shortfalls that Governor Reynolds signed this last week. Well, there are at least 9 budget bills that have to move to get that state budget across the finish line, and it may be harder than you think to spend $9.6 billion. Each one of those has to get through an appropriations subcommittee, the full appropriations committee, then the floor of the chamber, and repeat on the other side as they work out their differences. 3 bills moved this week in subcommittees. One of those was Senate Study Bill 3191 on the Senate side. This is the state's education system that includes all the appropriations outside of K-12 schools, although it does include a line item appropriation for therapeutic classrooms, which we support. In all 3 of those subcommittees, they just moved the governor's bill forward, and they haven't made any changes to that to accomplish the Senate's budget targets. Well, next we're going to talk about floor action this week. Senate File 2218 deals with school employment and identity verification. It requires the Board of Educational Examiners to verify the identity and employment eligibility of anybody applying to renew their license. It requires school districts and private schools and charter schools to verify identity and employment eligibility of new employees. The House amended it to require all employers, including private employers, to go through this exercise. The Senate refused to concur with that amendment, so they changed it back to the original Senate version and sent it back to the House. House File 2337 deals with academic fraud. It makes it a fraudulent practice to knowingly and with intent falsely represent having an academic degree in order to obtain employment or for personal gain. The Senate passed the bill unanimously. As they amended it, the House agreed and sent it to the governor. House File 2591 deals with open enrolled sports. It increases the period for ineligibility for a student that open enrolls into another district to participate in sports from 90 school days, which is current law, to instead be 140 calendar days. The reason explained for making this change is that there are now many school districts with 4-day school weeks, and for them, that 90 school days was a longer time period. The bill was amended in the Senate to begin August of 2026, and the Senate passed it unanimously, sending it back to the House. Senate File 2474, the school health plan data collection. This started out as a grant program to pay for automated external defibrillators, known as AEDs, in school districts. Because of a concern of unfunded mandates, they peeled this back to instead be a data collection that requires the department to gather information from schools on whether or not there's cardiac emergency provisions in your economic emergency plan, which schools have AEDs already, and if they have them, where those are located. It requires a report by January of 2027, and the Senate passed the bill 45-0, sending it back to the House. In committee action this week, House Appropriations took up and passed House File 2713 involving charter schools. We're registered opposed to the bill. It requires teacher salary supplement to follow students to charters, and we testified that that was inappropriate since the TSS is calculated based on the number of public school teachers you have, not students. It requires charter school students to be served in a public school extracurricular or activities program if the charter hasn't provided that to them in the last 2 years. The charters don't have to pay for that. It allows charter employees to participate in IPERS. It specifies that charter schools meet the definition of LEA for the purpose of federal funds. It allows private schools and charter schools to bond for facilities. It requires the Iowa Finance Authority to create a revolving loan fund for charter schools and includes private preschool through a 2080 agreement with minimal regulation. It sets a second application deadline for education savings accounts so families can apply by December 20th in order to begin school in the second semester. It requires the DE to establish a task force and make a report with recommendations regarding required health trainings for school staff. This last provision of the bill is the only thing that we support, and we are opposed to the rest of it. It was amended to remove private schools from the financing and bonding provisions, but kept in there that revolving loan fund for charter schools to be able to borrow and build facilities. It was approved 17-6, sending it to the House calendar. House File 2441, the Teach Iowa grants. This bill changes the Teach Iowa grant requirements for eligible teachers, and it was also approved in House Appropriations. It strikes the requirement that the candidate be in the top 25% of their class and requires 20% of that grant to go to special ed teachers and 50% to go to teachers in districts that have under than 1,000 students. It was approved 23-0, sending it to the House calendar. Senate File 2428, Student Behavior, just a heads up that is on the House calendar for debate on Monday. Our weekly report last week summarized the differences between this bill and the House's version, which we prefer. There's a new call to action out to help you focus advocacy on the unworkability of the Senate's proposal, requiring a committee of 2 teachers and an administrator to convene and determine when a student who is removed from the classroom can return to the classroom. Outreach is needed through the weekend and no later than late Monday morning. So what's next? Property taxes, negotiating behind the scenes, maybe, and perhaps not. The Iowa Capitol Dispatch article on Wednesday also covered these provisions of property taxes. They said the House is working on a compromise. The goal for property taxes as lawmakers and the governor aim to find a consensus on how to lower Iowa's property tax burden. And the House included some of the governor's provisions in their bill as it was amended coming out of the Ways and Means Committee. The Senate file, however, remains significantly different and hasn't made those kinds of changes. Speaker Grassley said that keeping a 2% set cap on valuation growth for cities and counties, which cannot be adjusted based on inflation as the Senate proposal would allow, is a major objective for House Republicans during negotiations on the final property tax bill. The Senate bill has a huge overhaul of the system. It eliminates the rollbacks. It reverses some of the 2013 property tax cuts for multi-residential buildings. It eliminates property taxes altogether for some older Iowans and indexes the state's gas tax to inflation. Although they didn't talk about it in the article, the things that schools are most concerned about is putting more state money into the formula rather than property taxes, the management fund levy limits if you have a larger ending balance, lower PEPL and debt levy maximum rates. Senator Dawson, who is the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, said in an Iowa Press interview a week ago that he believes the larger changes to Iowa's property tax system proposed in the Senate Republican bill are needed to meaningfully address the issue of property tax costs. Senator Dawson invited negotiation. He said the door is wide open for negotiation, and quote, "But I would say is that we have to be able to bring something meaningful to Iowans at the end of this. No more Band-Aids, no more simple approaches. Either we go after the system head on or we be honest with ourselves and say we fell short," end quote. That doesn't sound like there's a lot of room for negotiations. Advocacy actions. Keep talking about property tax reform advocacy, especially SAVE sustainability, and also now the limits to spending authority known as UAB. Explain why that spending authority is necessary and what happens with it with you declining enrollment and continued low SSA. Ask them not to punish districts for the conservative budget principles very similar to what you've just heard the leaders in the House and Senate talk about with the state's budgeting decisions over the last decade. That 35% limitation on UAB, that you couldn't carry forward more than 35% into your next budget year, becomes a use it or lose it decision, forcing increased cash reserve levy to pay for it, and that's the opposite of property tax reform. So look for some new calls to action on charter schools and student behavior bills. And remember, the best practice of lobbying is gentle persuasion applied relentlessly. Send an email. You can also leave a voice message on their phone. You can send a text making sure they got it. You can leave a message with the House and/or Senate switchboard, and they're only open when the legislature's in session, so they'll start answering the phones Monday at 1 o'clock if you haven't heard back from folks. Thanks to our Rural School Advocates of Iowa corporate sponsors. We appreciate their support and connection to rural school districts. Check out the corporate sponsor page on the RSAI website for more information about how to access their services. And if you have a company or service that you think would be supportive of rural schools, send them our way. There's so much on that website that you can find to help you with your advocacy, including access to these videos, position papers, weekly reports, those calls to action, which we encourage you to send to, share with other advocates who can help spread the word, and more. Check out this week's detailed written report for all the actions at the State House. We'll see you next week.